Okay, Scorpio. I have to be honest, the energy coming through this reading feels incredibly deep. I pulled your cards, sat with them for a moment, and wow, there was something about this message that wouldn't let me move on. It's almost like someone has been carrying feelings they can no longer ignore. Feelings they've tried to rationalize, suppress, or keep hidden for far too long. And the fact that you're here right now feels meaningful. Not because anything is guaranteed, but because something beneath the surface is asking to be seen. So take a deep breath, get comfortable, and just allow yourself to be present with this energy. Because what is unfolding here feels less like a beginning and more like a truth that has been waiting a very long time to be spoken. There's something about this energy that feels impossible to ignore. Not loud, not dramatic, just persistent. Like a thought that keeps returning when everything else has gone quiet. And honestly, the more I sit with it, the more it feels like someone has been trying very hard to convince themselves that this connection doesn't affect them the way it actually does. Okay, because what I'm picking up on here is a person who thought they had everything under control. Someone who believed they could compartmentalize their feelings, focus on logic, focus on what makes sense, focus on what feels safe. But every time they tried to move forward, every time they tried to place distance between themselves and what they feel for you, something kept pulling them back, not necessarily back to a conversation, not necessarily back to a memory, just back to you, back to your energy, back to the way you made them feel when nobody else was around. And wow, I don't think they expected that. I really don't. Because when I look at this judgment card sitting here, it feels like someone is having a difficult time ignoring their own truth anymore. Not because anyone is forcing them to face it. Not because someone is demanding answers. But because there's a difference between avoiding another person and avoiding yourself. And that's where things become complicated. You know, for a long time, they may have told themselves that this was just attraction. Maybe timing. Maybe curiosity. Maybe a connection that simply appeared at an unusual moment in their life. But those explanations don't seem to satisfy them anymore. It's almost as if every logical answer they've tried to create eventually falls apart the moment they think about you for too long. Because there is something about your presence that reaches places inside of them they normally keep hidden. The parts they don't show people. The parts they've spent years protecting. The parts that learned very early in life that vulnerability can be dangerous. And that's what makes this energy so intense. Because this person isn't only reacting to you. They're reacting to what happens inside themselves when they're around you. The Lover's card is sitting here now. And honestly, what stands out to me isn't romance. It's recognition. It's that strange feeling of looking at someone and realizing they're seeing parts of you that most people never notice. The version beneath the mask. The version beneath the expectations. The version beneath all the roles they've been playing. And I think that's exactly what unsettled them. Because it's easier to walk away from attraction. It's harder to walk away from recognition. It's harder to forget someone who somehow makes you feel seen. Even when they never intended to. Even when they weren't trying. And the thing is, I don't feel like this happened overnight. The Six of Cups feels almost like a quiet echo throughout this reading. Not necessarily nostalgia. Not necessarily the past. More like familiarity. The feeling that every encounter leaves a mark. The feeling that every conversation lingers longer than expected. The feeling that something about you stays with them long after you've gone. They may find themselves comparing other people to you without even realizing it. Hearing something that reminds them of you. Seeing something beautiful and immediately wondering what your reaction would be. Trying to move on with their day only to discover that somehow you're still there in the background of their thoughts. And honestly, that realization seems to be changing them. Because I don't think they expected you to matter this much. I don't think they expected your influence to reach this deeply into their life. For some of you, this person may have entered the connection, believing they were emotionally detached, believing they knew exactly who they were, believing they understood what love was supposed to look like. But now, I'm not so sure, because the energy starts shifting the moment the sun appears. And wow, it's almost like they're beginning to notice how different life feels when you are part of it. Not because everything suddenly becomes perfect, but because something feels more honest, more alive, more real. You have this way of making them question things they stopped questioning years ago. What actually makes them happy, what they truly want, what kind of life they're building, who they're becoming. And that's a powerful thing, because some people enter our lives and leave behind memories. Other people enter our lives and leave behind questions. But every once in a while, someone enters our life and changes the way we see ourselves. And that's where I feel this person is right now. standing somewhere between what they used to believe and what they're starting to understand. Trying to make sense of why your presence continues to affect them. Trying to understand why your energy keeps finding its way back into their heart. Trying to explain something that no longer fits inside the explanations they used to trust. And the more they sit with those feelings, the harder they become to hide. Because once someone reaches that point, pretending becomes exhausting. And honestly, that's the energy I keep coming back to here. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying two different versions of yourself for too long. The version that says, I'm fine, I've moved on, none of this matters. And the version that wakes up in quiet moments and whispers, that isn't true. Wow, that tension feels incredibly strong. Because I don't think this person is fighting you. I think they're fighting themselves. The moon is sitting here now, and the atmosphere around this reading changes immediately. Everything feels quieter, more private, more intimate. Like we're stepping into a room they rarely allow anyone to enter. You know, most people assume fear looks dramatic. Most people imagine fear as panic or chaos. But sometimes fear looks like avoidance. Sometimes fear looks like silence. Sometimes fear looks like someone convincing themselves they don't need something, simply because they're afraid of how much it means to them. And that's exactly what this feels like. There are emotions here that have existed for much longer than they've admitted. Thoughts they've pushed aside, questions they've avoided answering, memories they've tried to lock away. Yet every time they try to close the door, something inside them opens it again, because the truth keeps finding its way back, not loudly, not aggressively, just steadily, patiently, like water finding cracks in stone. And I keep feeling this strange vulnerability around them, almost as if they're beginning to realize that the walls they've built were never protecting them as much as they thought. Those walls may have kept disappointment out, but they also kept connection out. They kept intimacy out. They kept honesty out. And that's becoming harder to ignore. The death card appears here, and wow, something feels different. Not sudden, not explosive, just undeniable. Like standing in front of a mirror and realizing you can no longer recognize the person you've been pretending to be. Because some versions of ourselves have expiration dates. Some identities only exist because they helped us survive a certain chapter. But eventually, survival and living become two different things. And I think this person is starting to understand that. The old coping mechanisms, the old defenses, the old stories they've repeated to themselves, they're beginning to lose their power. Not because someone forced them to change, but because deep down, they know those patterns aren't giving them the life they actually want, honestly. That realization can be terrifying, because once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. Once you acknowledge a feeling, you can't unknow it. And that's where this energy becomes so emotional. Because there is grief here, real grief, not necessarily grief over losing another person, grief over losing an old version of themselves. The version that thought staying guarded was safer. The version that thought vulnerability was weakness. The version that believed control could protect them from heartbreak. And I don't think they're fully through that process yet. The hermit is sitting quietly beside all of this. And it feels like someone spending more time alone with their thoughts than usual. Someone questioning things they once considered absolute truths. Someone looking back across their own life and seeing patterns they never noticed before. Maybe certain relationships, maybe certain fears, maybe certain wounds. Because sometimes a connection doesn't just reveal what we want, sometimes it reveals what still hurts. And that's a very different kind of awakening. I keep hearing the phrase, I don't know why this affects me so much. That's what keeps echoing through the energy. Because part of them genuinely didn't expect this. They didn't expect you to become a catalyst. They didn't expect your presence to uncover emotions they had buried years ago. And they certainly didn't expect themselves to care this deeply. But they do. And that's what keeps bringing us back to judgment. Not as a moment, not as an event, more like an ongoing realization. A slow unfolding, a truth revealing itself piece by piece. Because this person is starting to see that what they've been feeling isn't temporary. It isn't something they can simply outthink. It isn't disappearing because they want it to. If anything, the more honest they become with themselves, the clearer everything gets. And that clarity is beginning to expose things they've spent a lifetime trying to hide. Not from other people, from themselves. Because once a feeling reaches a certain depth, the fear surrounding it changes. It isn't fear of the other person anymore. It's fear of what happens if you finally stop resisting. And honestly, that's where this energy feels incredibly human. Because I don't see someone confidently moving toward what they feel. I see someone standing at the edge of it, looking directly at it, knowing it's there, knowing it's real, and still hesitating. The Nine of Swords appears here, and wow, There's so much happening inside their mind when nobody else is around. You know those moments when the world finally gets quiet? No distractions, no conversations, no obligations, just you and your thoughts. That's where this person seems to be spending a lot of time lately. And the strange thing is, the more silence they find, the louder their emotions become. Because emotions have a way of waiting patiently. They don't disappear simply because they're ignored. They sit beneath the surface, waiting, watching, growing. And I feel like this person keeps arriving at the same realization over and over again. No matter how many different roads they take mentally, they somehow end up standing in front of the same truth. The truth that you matter, maybe more than they wanted, maybe more than they planned, maybe more than they're comfortable admitting. Okay, let's talk about vulnerability for a moment, because I think that's what this really comes down to. Not love, not attraction, not timing, vulnerability. The willingness to let another person see the parts of you that aren't polished, the parts that still hurt, the parts that still carry old disappointments. And honestly, I don't think this person has had an easy relationship with vulnerability. The moon is back again, not as confusion, not as uncertainty, but as exposure. Because some emotions feel safe when they stay hidden. They only become frightening when they step into the light. And that's exactly what seems to be happening. Feelings that once existed in private are beginning to demand acknowledgement, not from you, from them. They're being asked to look directly at what they've been avoiding. And I mean, that's uncomfortable. Especially for someone who has spent years believing they needed to stay in control. The Eight of Swords feels incredibly personal here. Like someone sitting inside a prison they built themselves. A prison made from assumptions, old experiences, old fears, old stories. Maybe they've convinced themselves that rejection is inevitable. Maybe they've convinced themselves they're not enough. Maybe they've convinced themselves that opening their heart only leads to disappointment. Whatever the story is, it's becoming harder for them to believe it completely. Because your presence keeps contradicting it. Your energy keeps challenging it. And that's creating tension. Not between the two of you, within them. Part of them wants to protect themselves. Part of them wants to take a chance on something they can't fully explain. Part of them wants certainty. Part of them is realizing certainty doesn't really exist. And wow, that's a difficult place to stand. Especially for someone who likes knowing where they are emotionally. Because this connection doesn't seem interested in staying inside neat little boxes. It keeps expanding. It keeps reaching deeper. It keeps asking bigger questions. And some of those questions don't have immediate answers. The Five of Cups enters the reading so quietly that it almost feels like a memory, a lingering ache, a shadow from another chapter. Because underneath all of this fear, I sense disappointment that existed long before you arrived. Old heartbreaks, old betrayals, old moments where trust was given and not protected. I don't think they're only reacting to what's happening now. I think they're reacting to everything they've survived before. And that's important. Because sometimes people aren't afraid of love itself. They're afraid of repeating pain. They're afraid of believing in something beautiful and watching it fall apart. They're afraid of investing emotionally and discovering they were wrong. And honestly, I think that's one of the biggest battles happening inside this person right now. Not whether they feel something. That part is becoming increasingly difficult to deny. The real battle is whether they can allow themselves to believe that what they're feeling deserves a chance to exist. Without controlling it, without predicting the outcome, without preparing for disappointment before anything has even happened. Because the deeper they go into these emotions, the more they realize this connection is asking them to do something they've avoided for a very long time. Trust themselves. Trust what they feel. Trust what their heart has been trying to say beneath all the noise. And that realization alone seems to be changing everything. Because eventually there comes a moment when staying the same becomes more uncomfortable than changing. And honestly, that's exactly where this person feels to be standing right now. Not at the finish line. Not at some grand revelation. Just at that quiet crossroads where they can no longer pretend that certain things still belong in their life. And wow, there's something surprisingly mature about this energy. Because I don't feel impulsiveness here. I don't feel someone rushing toward a decision simply because emotions are overwhelming. I feel someone observing, watching, evaluating, paying attention to what gives them peace and what takes it away. The Two of Wands is sitting here, and I keep getting this image of somebody looking out at a horizon they never seriously considered before. Not because the opportunity wasn't there, because they weren't ready to see it. You know, sometimes life changes the moment we stop asking, what am I afraid of losing? And start asking, what am I missing by staying here? And I think that question has been following this person around lately. because certain situations that once felt acceptable no longer feel comfortable. Certain conversations no longer feel meaningful. Certain connections no longer feel aligned. They're beginning to notice how much energy they've been giving to things that don't actually nourish them. And that's creating distance, not necessarily physical distance, emotional distance. The kind that happens when your soul starts moving before the rest of your life catches up. The Eight of Cups appears, and honestly, this doesn't feel like abandonment. It feels like awareness, because walking away becomes easier when you finally understand what you're walking toward. For a long time, I think this person kept trying to convince themselves that if they just waited long enough, certain people would change, certain circumstances would improve, certain wounds would magically disappear. But something has shifted. They're realizing that some chapters don't need more effort, they need closure. And that realization isn't easy, especially when history is involved, especially when comfort is involved, especially when familiarity is involved, because familiarity has a strange way of disguising itself as happiness. And I think this person is finally starting to recognize the difference. Okay, let's talk about the Death card for a second, because it's sitting right in the middle of all this energy. Not loudly, not dramatically, just present, like an old version of their life quietly packing its bags. And honestly, I don't think they're mourning relationships as much as they're mourning identities. The version of themselves that tolerated less than they deserved. The version that kept settling. The version that kept shrinking their truth to make other people comfortable. Something about that old self feels tired. Not broken, just tired. Tired of carrying expectations that no longer fit. Tired of protecting situations that have already run their course. Tired of pretending certain things still matter when deep down they don't. And wow, that takes courage to admit. Because letting go isn't always about losing people. Sometimes it's about losing illusions. The illusion that everyone will understand. The illusion that everyone will approve. The illusion that growth can happen without discomfort. I mean, growth is uncomfortable. Especially when it asks you to leave behind pieces of your life that once felt permanent. And this person seems to be accepting that now, slowly, carefully, one realization at a time. The Fool begins to appear in the energy, and suddenly everything feels lighter. Not easy, just lighter. Like someone taking their first full breath after spending years holding it. Because for the first time in a long time, they aren't making decisions based entirely on fear. They're becoming curious again. Curious about possibilities. Curious about happiness. Curious about what life might look like if they stopped letting old disappointments dictate every future choice. And honestly, that curiosity feels healing because fear keeps asking, what if everything goes wrong? But curiosity asks, what if there's more waiting for me than I can currently see? And that's a very different perspective, a much freer perspective. I keep feeling this sense that they're preparing for something important, not an announcement, not a dramatic action, an internal decision, the kind nobody else sees at first, the kind that happens quietly in the heart long before it becomes visible in the outside world. Because the truth is, every major life change begins as a private conversation with yourself. And I think that's exactly what this person is having. A conversation about what matters. A conversation about what deserves their energy. A conversation about who they want to become. And the more honest those answers become, the less room there is for everything that no longer belongs in their future. Because there is a difference between carrying a truth and speaking a truth. One lives inside the heart. The other changes reality. And honestly, I think that's exactly what this person is wrestling with now. Not whether they feel something. Not whether their emotions are real. The real question seems to be, what happens once I say it out loud? Because words have consequences. Words create movement. Words remove places to hide. And for someone who has spent so much time protecting their inner world, that's a terrifying thought. The King of Cups appears here, and wow, the energy feels different, more grounded, more mature, less reactive. It's almost like this person has been learning how to sit with their emotions instead of running from them. Not perfectly. Not every day, but enough to notice a change. Enough to realize that feelings don't automatically disappear just because they're ignored. I keep seeing someone replaying conversations in their mind. Conversations that never happened. Things they wish they had said. Things they wish they had explained. Moments where they stayed silent when part of them wanted to speak. And honestly, that silence feels heavier now than it used to. Because silence can protect you for a while. But eventually it starts feeling like a burden, especially when there's something important underneath it. Something meaningful. Something real. The Ace of Cups is sitting here, and there is such a vulnerability surrounding this card. Not dramatic vulnerability, not grand declarations. Something quieter, something softer. like someone slowly lowering their guard, like someone realizing that being emotionally honest may actually be less painful than constantly hiding. You know, people often think courage looks fearless, but some of the bravest moments happen when someone is scared and chooses honesty anyway. And that's the energy I'm picking up here, because I don't feel someone preparing a perfect speech. I don't feel someone trying to control every outcome. I feel someone becoming tired of carrying everything alone. And that's a very different motivation. They're beginning to understand that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's connection. It's allowing another person to see what exists beneath all the layers. And honestly, I think you've inspired that realization more than you know, not because you've forced it, not because you've demanded it, but because your presence has consistently challenged the idea that they need to hide every part of themselves. The Judgment card returns, and there is something almost emotional about seeing it again, because this feels less like a decision and more like acceptance. Acceptance of what they already know. Acceptance of what they've already been feeling. Acceptance of truths they've spent months, maybe even years, trying to negotiate with. I mean, there comes a point where the heart stops asking for permission. It simply asks to be heard, and that's where this person seems to be arriving. They may still have fears. They may still have doubts. But those fears no longer feel stronger than the truth itself. And that's significant. Because for a very long time, fear was leading. Fear was making decisions. Fear was setting boundaries. Fear was writing the story. Now something else is beginning to take its place. Something more honest. Something more authentic. Something that sounds suspiciously like hope. The Eight of Wands suddenly changes the rhythm of the reading. Everything starts feeling faster. Not rushed, just ready. Like energy that has been sitting still for too long finally wanting to move. And honestly, I don't think this is only about communication with you. I think it's about communication with themselves first, because every important conversation begins internally. Before we speak our truth to another person, we have to admit it to ourselves. And I think that process is already happening. The walls aren't as strong as they used to be. The excuses aren't as convincing as they used to be. The distance isn't providing the answers it once did, and that's creating momentum. Momentum toward honesty. Momentum toward clarity. Momentum toward expression. I keep feeling this image of someone standing in front of a door they've passed 100 times. A door they've looked at, thought about, wondered about, but never opened. Not because they didn't want to, because they weren't ready. And something feels different now. They're reaching for the handle. Not because all their fears have disappeared. Not because every uncertainty has been resolved. But because staying silent is beginning to feel more uncomfortable than speaking. Because some truths become impossible to carry forever. Some emotions become impossible to disguise forever. And the deeper this person allows themselves to feel, the more they realize that what they've been protecting may actually be the very thing they most want to share. Because once someone begins imagining a future differently, they start paying attention to things they used to overlook. And honestly, that's what feels so striking about this energy. For the first time, I don't see someone focusing solely on emotions. I see someone thinking about what those emotions could actually become. And wow, that's a very different mindset. Because feelings can be intense. Feelings can be beautiful. Feelings can be overwhelming. But eventually there comes a moment when the question shifts from, how do I feel, to, what can I build with this? And that's exactly where this person seems to be arriving. The Seven of Pentacles is sitting here, and the atmosphere feels thoughtful, reflective, patient. Like someone looking across a field they've spent a long time cultivating and finally asking themselves what deserves their continued investment. You know, maturity changes the way we view love. At first, people often chase excitement, then they chase certainty, then they chase validation. But somewhere along the way, something deeper begins to matter. Consistency, trust, peace, shared values, a sense of partnership, and I think this person is beginning to realize that what draws them toward you isn't something temporary. It's not built entirely on chemistry. It's not built entirely on longing. There's something much more substantial beneath it. Something that continues to hold its shape even after all the confusion, all the hesitation, all the internal battles. And honestly, that realization seems to surprise them. Because the longer they sit with these feelings, the less they resemble a passing emotional experience. The more they resemble a vision, a possibility, a life. The Wheel of Fortune appears, and suddenly there is this awareness that life has been quietly changing them all along. Not through dramatic events, through perspective, through growth, through lessons they didn't fully appreciate until now. I keep feeling like this person is looking back at older versions of themselves. The person they were 5 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe even 1 year ago. and realizing that the things they once thought mattered most don't carry the same weight anymore. Success looks different. Happiness looks different. Love looks different. Even their definition of a meaningful life feels different, and somehow you seem connected to that transformation. Not because you caused it, because your presence became part of the journey, part of the reflection, part of the awakening. The Empress appears here, and wow, there is something incredibly beautiful about the energy surrounding this card. Not because it feels perfect, because it feels nurturing, safe, steady. I keep sensing that when this person thinks about you, they're no longer only thinking about what they can receive. They're beginning to think about what they can contribute, what they can offer, how they can show up differently, how they can become a better version of themselves. And honestly, that's one of the clearest signs of emotional growth. Because immature love often asks, what can this person give me? Mature love begins asking, how can I help create something meaningful with this person? And that shift feels important, very important. The Ten of Cups begins to emerge, and there is this quiet softness surrounding the reading now. Not fantasy, not obsession. Something far more grounded. The image I'm getting is simple. Two people sitting together after a long day. Nothing dramatic happening. Nothing extraordinary taking place. Just peace. Just presence. Just knowing you're exactly where you want to be. And I think that's what this person is starting to understand. The future they're envisioning isn't built on grand gestures. It's built on authenticity. It's built on emotional honesty. It's built on choosing each other repeatedly through different seasons of life. Because they're beginning to see that lasting connection isn't created in a single moment. It's created through time, through patience, through growth, through mutual effort. And perhaps that's why they no longer seem interested in rushing anything. Because they understand something now that they didn't understand before. The strongest foundations aren't built quickly. They're built carefully. They're built intentionally. They're built one honest choice at a time. Okay, and I have to say this. There is a noticeable sense of calm entering their energy. Not because every question has been answered. Not because every obstacle has disappeared. But because they're no longer fighting themselves the way they once were. The conflict that dominated so much of this journey feels quieter now. Less chaotic, less reactive, more accepting. They're beginning to trust the process of becoming. Trust the lessons they've learned. Trust the person they're growing into. And perhaps most importantly, they're beginning to trust that some connections are worth tending slowly, worth protecting, worth investing in, worth allowing the necessary time to mature into something real. Because when they look ahead now, they aren't only seeing emotions, they're seeing potential, they're seeing partnership, they're seeing a future that feels very different from the one they once imagined. And for the first time in a very long time, that future doesn't feel intimidating, it feels meaningful. And honestly, I think that's where I'm going to leave this energy for now. If this reading resonated with you, take what feels meaningful and leave the rest. Sometimes the most important messages aren't the ones that give us answers. They're the ones that help us understand our own hearts a little more clearly. Thank you for spending this time with me and allowing me to share this space with you. I truly appreciate every one of you. Take care of yourself. Be gentle with your heart. And remember, some of the most meaningful transformations happen quietly, long before anyone else can see them. Until next time, wishing you peace, clarity, and all the love you deserve. Bye for now.